June 6, 1944, 3:30 a.m., fields east of the village of Merville, Normandy, France. The aircraft engines of the Royal Air Force transport planes faded into the darkness as hundreds of paratroopers began to descend through low cloud over the Norman countryside. They belonged to the 9th Parachute Battalion of the British 6th Airborne Division. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway. Their objective lay less than 2 miles away, a German coastal artillery position known as the Merville Battery. Inside that fortified position stood 4 reinforced concrete casemates. Intelligence reports believed each bunker held a 150mm coastal artillery gun capable of firing shells more than 10 miles. The target was clear: Sword Beach. If those guns remained operational, they could bombard the British landing forces, scheduled to arrive shortly after dawn. Landing craft packed with soldiers from the 3rd British Infantry Division would be exposed in open water. From the air, the plan seemed simple. The 9th Parachute Battalion would drop behind enemy lines before dawn. Engineers would breach the wire and minefields surrounding the battery. Assault teams would destroy the guns. Then they would withdraw toward friendly forces advancing inland from the beaches. But the moment the first parachutes opened, the operation began to unravel. Heavy cloud and German anti-aircraft fire disrupted the drop formation of the transport aircraft. Pilots maneuvered violently to avoid flak bursts. Paratroopers exited their aircraft across a wide stretch of countryside. Some landed miles away from their assigned drop zones. Others fell into flooded marshland deliberately created by German defensive engineering. Many drowned before reaching dry ground. By 4:30 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Otway had reached the planned rendezvous point near a small orchard outside the village of Le Plain. He checked his watch under the faint glow of a shaded torch. The attack was scheduled for 4:50 a.m., but the battalion was missing. The operational plan called for more than 600 paratroopers to assemble with heavy equipment. They were supposed to bring Bangalore torpedoes, explosive charges designed to clear barbed wire and minefields. They were supposed to bring heavy Vickers machine guns for suppression fire. They were supposed to bring mortar teams to neutralize German strongpoints. Instead, only fragments of the battalion arrived in the darkness. By 4:40 a.m., just about 150 men had assembled. Many carried only rifles and a few grenades. Most of the engineering equipment was missing. The battalion had lost nearly 70% of its assault strength before the attack even began. The strategic situation forced a brutal decision. The guns at Merville had to be silenced before the amphibious landings began. At 7:25 a.m., the first assault waves would approach Sword Beach. If the battery remained active, German artillery observers could adjust fire onto the landing zones. The result could destroy landing craft, scatter formations, and slow the Allied advance inland. The entire eastern flank of the Normandy invasion depended on neutralizing that single artillery position. Otway understood the map. Behind the beachhead lay the vital bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal, already under attack by glider troops from Major John Howard Company of the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. If the beach landings stalled, those isolated airborne forces could be cut off and destroyed. A chain reaction could unfold across the eastern invasion sector. Otway gathered his officers beside a hedgerow. They studied a hand-drawn sand table illuminated by a dim torch. The Merville Battery was protected by multiple defensive layers. First came a wide belt of barbed wire obstacles. Behind that lay a minefield estimated at more than 200 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. Inside the perimeter were trenches, machine gun nests, and 4 massive concrete gun casemates. The battery garrison belonged to the German 736th Infantry Regiment, part of the 716th Static Infantry Division. Approximately 150 German troops defended the position. Even with the full battalion, the assault would have been dangerous. With only 150 paratroopers, it was close to impossible. But the clock continued to move toward dawn. At 4:45 a.m., Otway issued the order. The battalion would attack anyway. Small teams formed quickly. One group would cut the wire using whatever tools they carried. Another would rush the trenches with grenades. Assault teams would enter each casemate and destroy the artillery guns with explosive charges. There would be no artillery support, no air support, no reinforcements. Only the men who had landed nearby in the dark fields of Normandy. By 4:50 a.m., the scattered survivors of the 9th Parachute Battalion began moving across the open ground toward the silent outline of the Merville Battery. Ahead of them, German sentries stood watch along the wire. Behind those sentries sat the guns that could threaten the entire British landing force at Sword Beach. The paratroopers had less than 2 hours before the invasion fleet arrived offshore, and they were about to attack one of the most heavily fortified artillery positions on the Normandy coast. What they did not yet know was that the greatest danger inside the battery was not the German soldiers guarding the walls. It was the unexpected truth about the guns themselves. June 6, 1944, 4:50 a.m. Approach to the Merville Battery, Normandy. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway raised his hand in the darkness. Across the wet fields, small groups of paratroopers from the 9th Parachute Battalion crawled toward the outer wire of the German battery. There were supposed to be more than 600 men. Now there were about 150. The missing equipment created the first problem. The assault plan depended on Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps through barbed wire and clear safe paths through the minefields. Most of those torpedoes never reached the ground. Aircraft had scattered them miles away during the drop. Instead, the engineers of the battalion used wire cutters and bayonets. Private soldiers lay flat in the mud while carefully lifting strands of German double-apron barbed wire obstacles. Each movement had to be slow. The minefield lay immediately behind the wire. German engineers had planted a mixture of S-mine anti-personnel mines and Tellermine anti-tank mines. The S-mine was designed to jump into the air before exploding. It scattered steel fragments across a wide radius. A single mistake could alert the entire garrison. By 5:10 a.m., several narrow gaps existed in the outer wire. But the noise had already begun. A German sentry spotted movement near the southern edge of the perimeter. A flare pistol fired upward. White light flooded the battery position. Machine guns opened immediately. German MG-34 machine guns, firing 7.92 millimeter rounds, swept across the minefield. Several paratroopers were hit before they even reached the trenches. The quiet approach was finished. Otway shouted the order to charge. The battalion surged forward. Men ran through the minefield, sometimes deliberately stepping in the footprints of the soldier ahead. Explosions erupted across the field as mines detonated. By 5:15 a.m., the first assault teams reached the inner trench system. The trenches surrounding the casemates formed a defensive ring designed to channel attackers into narrow fire lanes. German infantry from the 736th Infantry Regiment rushed to their firing positions. Close combat began almost immediately. Paratroopers used Lee Enfield No. 4 rifles, Sten submachine guns, and hand grenades. The German defenders fired Carabiner 98K rifles and continued firing the MG-34 machine guns from protected positions. The battle became fragmented. Small groups fought separate engagements along the trench lines. Communication inside the battalion began to collapse. Otway could no longer see most of his companies. The battalion originally contained Company A, Company B, Company C, and Company D. Now those companies existed only as scattered clusters of survivors. Despite the chaos, several assault teams reached the first casemate. The concrete structure was massive. Walls measured nearly 2 meters thick. The steel-armored gun embrasure faced north toward the English Channel. The entrance door sat at the rear, protected by a narrow trench corridor. Sergeant-level leaders led small teams through those corridors under constant fire. At 5:20 a.m., a demolition team reached the entrance of the first bunker. They carried a small number of plastic explosive charges, far less than originally planned. The door was blown open. Inside the casemate stood a large artillery piece. But the weapon was not what British intelligence expected. It was not a modern 150mm coastal gun. Instead, the crew found an older Czech-built Skoda 100mm field gun mounted inside the concrete shelter. The gun could still fire dangerous shells toward Sword Beach, but its range and destructive power were lower than feared. There was no time to analyze the difference. Explosives were placed against the recoil system and breech mechanism. The charge detonated seconds later. The gun was destroyed. Outside the bunker, the fight continued along the trench network. German soldiers attempted to regroup around the remaining casemates. Machine gun fire poured across the battery interior. Another assault team reached the second casemate by 5:25 a.m. Again, a demolition charge destroyed the artillery piece. The cost of each advance was severe. Dozens of British paratroopers were already wounded or killed. The battalion was shrinking minute by minute, yet the attack continued deeper into the battery. 2 more casemates remained active, and the eastern sky was beginning to lighten toward dawn. Far offshore in the English Channel, the invasion fleet carrying the 3rd British Infantry Division was already moving toward Sword Beach. If even one gun at Merville survived long enough to fire during the landings, the artillery observers could begin adjusting shells onto the approaching landing craft. The battle inside the battery had entered its most dangerous phase. The surviving paratroopers had destroyed half the guns. But the German defenders were now fully awake, fully armed, and fighting for the remaining positions. And the smallest mistake inside the next bunker could turn the entire assault into a disaster. June 6, 1944, 5:28 a.m. Inside the Merville Battery, Normandy, smoke from the destroyed guns drifted through the trench network as the surviving paratroopers of the 9th Parachute Battalion pressed deeper into the German position. 2 casemates remained active. German soldiers from the 736th Infantry Regiment had now concentrated their defense around the remaining bunkers. Machine gun crews repositioned their MG-34 machine guns to fire directly along the trench lines. The narrow trenches forced attackers into predictable movement paths. Each turn in the trench could expose a small assault team to direct automatic fire. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway could see the situation deteriorating. Many of his officers were already casualties. Company formations no longer existed. Instead, the fight continued through small clusters of soldiers led by sergeants and corporals. The battalion had entered the battery with about 150 men. By 5:30 a.m., fewer than 100 remained able to fight, but the strategic objective still remained clear: Every operational gun destroyed inside the battery reduced the threat to Sword Beach. If the artillery remained silent when the British landing craft reached the shore, the invasion timetable on the eastern flank of Normandy could remain intact. Otway directed the next assault toward the third casemate. The bunker entrance sat at the end of a trench protected by sandbagged firing points. German riflemen fired carabiner 98K rifles from the trench corner as the paratroopers approached. The British assault team used Sten submachine guns to suppress the defenders, while another soldier threw 2 grenades into the trench junction. The explosions stunned the defenders long enough for the team to reach the bunker door. At 5:34 a.m., a demolition charge blasted open the entrance. Inside the bunker stood the 3rd artillery piece. Again, the gun proved to be another Czech Skoda 100mm field gun mounted on a static platform inside the concrete casemate. The demolition team quickly placed explosive charges against the breech assembly and recoil cylinder. Seconds later, the detonation shattered the gun mechanism. 3 guns were now destroyed. Only 1 casemate remained. But German resistance inside the battery intensified. A surviving machine gun crew established a firing position covering the final bunker approach. The weapon fired bursts of 7.92mm rounds down the trench corridor. 2 British soldiers attempting to advance were hit immediately. The assault stalled for several minutes. Those minutes mattered. By 5:40 a.m., dawnlight began to appear over the Norman countryside. Visibility improved across the battery position. German defenders could now see movement inside the trench lines more clearly. At the same time, the approaching Allied invasion fleet was now less than 15 miles offshore. The landing waves aimed at Sword Beach were already organizing their approach formations. Otway knew the final gun had to be destroyed immediately. A small assault group of paratroopers moved along a side trench that curved toward the rear of the last casemate. The path allowed them to approach from a blind angle outside the machine gun line of fire. The team reached the bunker entrance shortly before 5:45 a.m. The door was partially blocked by debris from earlier fighting. Instead of placing a demolition charge on the door, one soldier forced the entrance open just wide enough to throw an explosive charge inside. The blast erupted within the concrete chamber. Moments later, the team entered the bunker. The final artillery gun stood damaged but not completely destroyed. Additional explosives were placed directly against the breech and mounting frame. At 5:48 a.m., the final charge detonated. The 4th artillery gun of the Merville battery was silenced. The strategic objective of the assault had been achieved, but the situation for the battalion remained dangerous. German reinforcements from nearby positions could arrive at any moment. The 9th Parachute Battalion had suffered devastating losses. Of the roughly 600 men assigned to the mission, only about 150 had reached the assault position. After the battle, fewer than 70 were still able to move without assistance. Otway ordered an immediate withdrawal from the battery. The surviving paratroopers moved south toward the village of Gonneville-sur-Merville, where they planned to regroup with other elements of the 6th Airborne Division. Behind them, the destroyed artillery guns remained inside the shattered casemates. Less than 2 hours later, at 7:25 a.m., the first landing craft of the 3rd British Infantry Division reached the shoreline of Sword Beach. No artillery shells from Merville Battery fell among them. The silence of those guns helped secure the eastern flank of the Normandy invasion. The destruction of the battery also protected the airborne forces holding the vital bridges across the Orne River and Caen Canal, ensuring that the Allied advance inland could begin without artillery fire from that position. The battle for Normandy would continue for weeks, but in the dark hours before dawn, fewer than 100 exhausted paratroopers had already altered the battlefield. They had landed scattered across enemy territory. They had attacked a fortified artillery position with a fraction of their planned strength. And they had completed the mission before the invasion fleet appeared on the horizon.